and welcome everyone to the 2016 Jewish Futures Conference. We are so excited to have you here. I'll go off script for a moment and say that someone mentioned as I was walking in that if we really wanted this to be a happiness conference, we'd have had an open bar. And it reminded me of that amazing moment, and this will peg my age, on the CD recording of the concert, the Simon and Garfunkel concert in Central Park, where Simon says, just want to express our gratitude to the guys who are selling loose joints, who are donating half of their proceeds to the Jewish Education Project. So thank you. I'm Aaron Dorfman, president of Lippman Canfor Foundation for Living Torah, and on behalf of the foundation and in partnership with the Jewish Education Project, I want to thank all of you for coming together with us today to co-create this conference and this project. And as always, I want to acknowledge and appreciate the work of the Jewish Education Project is made possible with the partnership and support of UJA Federation of New York. Aliza's already introduced you to your journals. We had a great time designing them. I hope you really enjoy using them. So why the Jewish Futures Conference? It's an opportunity to create connections among extraordinary people. We hope that you take advantage of the time together to make some new connections and maybe rekindle some old ones. It's a venue in which to experience and practice new ways, new ideas, new approaches to things. And I think most importantly, it's a laboratory in which to generate new ways of thinking about the Jewish community and for Jewish education in particular. And we hope to do that. And why the theme of happiness? I ran into someone else who mentioned that she was on her way here and people were saying, Jewish conference on happiness? Like, what gives? It's a little odd maybe for a people who pride ourselves on our disgruntlement and dissatisfaction with the way things are. Funny, yes. Happiness, not so sure. From the outset, we understood that happiness isn't just about smiles and laughter, but about a deeper sense of satisfaction, fulfillment, being at peace with ourselves, and that as human beings who live in the world, a world that often makes happiness challenging or nearly impossible, the search for happiness and fulfillment in some ways are acts of resistance. Resistance to mortality, resistance to banality, resistance to the everyday barrage of horrors that we call the news. So this conference has a point of view that Judaism and Jewish wisdom in particular have the capacity to help make people better versions of themselves, more successful human beings who can thrive, flourish, and improve the world. We are a people committed to the never-ending project of repairing and perfecting the world. And that means our vision of happiness is not blithe or superficial, it's an act of meaning-making. And especially in trying times, it can be an act of rebellion. We Jews may be happy, but we're never happy-go-lucky. And by extension, Jewish learning and education, if they are to have meaning and relevance in the world and to compete in the great marketplace of ideas, must help human beings to flourish, to be happy, and to realize their potential. To help us get started today, please join me in welcoming Dr. Dan Ariely. Dan is the James B. Duke Professor of Psychology and Behavioral Economics at Duke University, a world-renowned expert in those fields and a trusted advisor and friend to the foundation. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that he's also a recipient of the 2008 Ig Nobel Award in Medicine, which makes me, a not-so-closeted nerd, very happy. Dan.
So good morning. So since Eliza described to you her commute, I thought I'll describe to you my commute. So I left home on November 20th. And I went to England and Israel and Johannesburg and Cape Town and San Francisco, Cincinnati, New York. I was here on Friday giving a talk to university at Columbia University in this very auditorium. Back to Israel, and I arrived this morning at 4:30. Everything worked great. So a little jet-lagged, but I want to talk a little bit about happiness. And you know, we have this notion of happiness, that happiness is about sitting on the beach drinking mojito, open bar, or that it's maybe watching a sitcom. But is it? What is real happiness? So maybe about a little bit more than a year and a half ago, I get a quick email from somebody and says, please call me. And I called the guy, and it turns out that he became quadriplegic. He was a PhD student. He jumped to the ocean, broke his neck, and he asked me to talk to him a year after he got injured, when it was clear he was not getting better. And I get lots of people with injuries writing me, and they all kind of see what they've lost, and they try to figure out how can they live with some happiness after the injury. And anyway, I talked to the guy, and I tried to understand what's his life circumstances, what brings him happiness, what could bring him happiness, what he's tried and failed, and so on. And he was kind of good in algorithms, and he had an uncle that was doing some startup, and we agreed that he was going to try and help his uncle. He also hated all these books that say that the injury was the best thing that ever happened to people, so we decided he's going to try and write a book against that. And we kind of made action plans for how he was going to continue. And he also asked me, what do I think about committing suicide? I said, you know, I'm not against it, but you know, we have 2 other plans. Let's check those other plans first. And we kept on talking about once a week, and he made some progress, not a lot, and so on. And 4 months later, he did commit suicide. And his sister called to let me know. And it started me wondering, like, why did he give up? What was the things, you know, probably not one, but what were the things that made him give up? So I started talking to people with lots of injuries, a lot of quadriplegics because of his particular situation. And a couple of the people I talked to recently, one of them in particular, takes on himself tremendous daily challenges. This is a guy who used to be a cyclist who broke his neck, but he got somebody to build him a mountain bike from a wheelchair mountain bike with a very powerful engine, very low to the ground, very powerful wheels. This guy asks people to lay his clothes on the floor, and he wiggles into them for 45 minutes, trying to dress himself up, and he times himself. He goes out, he's outside of Boston, he goes out in the winter, it takes him an hour to get dressed, 45 minutes on his bike, 4 hours to defrost afterward. He times himself for everything he does, and he measures small progress. His dream is to be able to sleep at night with no person taking care of him. Right? He thinks he can achieve it in 3 years. And he makes tremendous small progress. And I think one of the lessons from that was that when we think about the meaning of life, kind of in a big sense, it's sometimes depressing. Right? And that's how I felt very much after the election. But we can think about the big picture, and that's tough and difficult and complex. But if we break it down to small challenges, right? Can we change one thing? Can we improve on something, and so on? We can become much happier and much more fulfilled. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I've got myself into lots of situations with people with very difficult injuries, and this process is very tough for me, right? It's not as if I go into these discussions and I'm happy and joyful and enjoying it in the sense that we would call something enjoyable. But nevertheless, I find myself attracted to those aspects. And it's not that as if I have like some S&M, desire. I think it's about the fact that the definition of happiness is not the definition we think it is. Think about something like marathons. If you came from outer space and you watched people running a marathon, what would you think? They must have done something terrible. Somebody punished them. I don't understand why were they punished them in this terrible way, but they're clearly suffering. It's just awful. How do we do it to people? And it's true that if you measure the happiness in brainwave, brain activity, facial expression, whatever it is, as people running the marathon, you would say they're miserable people. But even though we have momentary misery, it does give us happiness in a different sense. And it's happiness that comes from a sense of purpose and meaning and contribution to others. It's a very different type of happiness, and they're actually not consistent. There are very few things like helping other people, running a marathon, climbing a mountain, starting a company, doing all kinds of things that are accompanied by a lot of momentary happiness. But nevertheless, that's the happiness we want. How many of us would want a life of happiness that is sitting every night drinking and watching comedy, right? The life that we want is probably a life that has less momentary happiness, but more of the long-term happiness. Okay, so that's kind of thought number one, is maybe we should think about two types of happiness. Happiness type 1, which is about momentary joy, and happiness type 2, which might not have momentary joy, but gives us a very different sense. And maybe what we do is we do too much of, or we aim, when we say we have the right to pursue happiness, we think too much of type 1 and not enough of type 2. Okay. The next thing I want to say about happiness is that happiness is often a relative term rather than absolute term. Let's think for a second about regret. What is regret? What is regret? Regret is a really interesting emotion. Regret is about the fact that our happiness is not driven by where we are. It's driven by a contrast between where we are and where we think we could have been. And if we think we could have been somewhere better, we're miserable. And if we think we could have been somewhere worse, we're happy. But it's about the relative comparison. For example, imagine that you missed your flight. And you missed your flight by either 2 minutes or 2 hours. When would you be more upset? The 2 minutes. Why? Why would you be more upset in the 2 minutes case? Because you're so close, right? In the 2 minutes case, you basically say to yourself, there are all kinds of ways that I could have made it. As you run to the plane and you see the plane leaving the gate and you see seat 7E, you say, I could have been there. You say, if the light changed a little faster, if the person in front of me understood what no liquids means, if the TSA agent had one more IQ point, I could have been there. And because of that, you could imagine that reality. You can almost feel it, and it creates a contrast to where you are, and you feel terrible in comparison. If you missed your flight by 2 hours, you can't create. There's no if only. You don't have this reality, and you just say, okay, I missed my flight. Let's deal with it. A few years ago, they took pictures of people who won medals in the Olympics, and they measured how big was their smile. What would you expect? Gold, silver, bronze. No. Gold, bronze, silver. Why were the silver people the least happy? Because imagine that for 4 years, you got up extra early every morning and did whatever exercise you do. And then 90 seconds ago, you got second place. What is the thought you can't help but having? Remember that last Wednesday when I cut the training a little short? You remember that? But you can't not have those thoughts. And if you got the bronze, what do you say? At least I'm here. Look at everybody else. And actually, if you think about your own lives, you can probably find lots of cases where our happiness is not really in terms of absolute case. It's about relative case. What do we compare ourselves to? Which, of course, means that the circles that you choose to be part of will determine your happiness to a big degree. The friends that you pick, the neighbors that you pick are going to influence your happiness to a very large degree, and if we pick those things more wisely, we can do better. I also think that the exercise for gratitude are very helpful in that regard. Okay. The other thing about happiness, also in terms of relativity, is something called the hedonic treadmill. So one of the interesting aspects about happiness is we get used to things, right? We get used to stuff. And by the way, getting used to stuff has negative and positive consequences. When people have difficult injuries, they think to themselves, life is going to be terrible and it will keep on being terrible for a long time. It turns out life is terrible, but people get used to it. It becomes less terrible than people think it would be. It also happens on the positive side. Something good happens and you think to yourself, this will be great, and it will be great for a really long time. Turns out it's great, but not for that long of a time. By the way, this happens a lot in relationships, right? So, of course, when people fall in love, they think, oh, I'm so in love, this will last me forever. Not so much. But also when people break up, they say it's so painful, it will probably be painful forever. No, it goes away faster. By the way, it goes away faster for women than for men. Women more quickly realize it wasn't that bad to break up with men. But one of the things that happen with adaptation, so adaptation is this process by which we get used to stuff. One of the process is this hedonic treadmill. What happens is we think to ourselves that if we change our life circumstances, life will become great. So we say, if I only got a new car, life will be fantastic. And then what happens? We get a new car. And the new car is fantastic. But then it goes down. And what happened? You say to yourself, I remember, now I'm not so happy anymore, but I remember what made me happy last time. I bought a new car. Let me renovate the kitchen. And again, renovating the kitchen brings us happiness. And then it goes down, and then we say to ourselves, oh, I've had these experiences. Every time I buy something new, I become happier. Now I'm not happy. I need some more excitement in our lives. But these excitements are short-lasting and not long-lasting. I'll come back to this later, but there's a big puzzle about the relationship between money and happiness. And the basic finding is that people do in general become happier when they have more money, but their function is very steep, up to about $70,000 a year in the US. Being poor is absolutely terrible. But above 70,000, money doesn't buy people a lot of happiness. And the question, of course, is why? Why doesn't money buy people as much happiness as they think it will? And one of the reasons is the hedonic treadmill. The actress Bo Derek, if you remember her, was the first one who expressed this idea very wisely. She said, if you think money can't buy happiness, you don't know where to go shopping. And she was right, not in the sense that she meant it, but she was right in the sense that when we try to use money to buy happiness, we often buy stuff. And what happens with stuff is that we buy it and we get used to it. And we buy short-term happiness rather than long-term happiness. One of the keys to buying happiness is to buy experiences. And it turns out when we buy experiences, these experiences stay with us for longer. So you ask yourself, I can learn scuba diving or I can buy a new sofa. A new sofa will stay with me, the scuba diving will go away. That's true, but the happiness that you will get from the sofa will go down very quickly. While the happiness you would get from learning how to scuba dive, acquiring a new skill, having a new adventure, is going to stay with you for much longer. Anyway, so think about this question of happiness type 1, happiness type 2, one that is about momentary enjoyment, one is about long-lasting effect. And then think about this notion of adaptation. This question of what are the things that give us prolonged happiness? How do we judge ourselves in relative ways to other people? What is the relative part of happiness? And what is the long-term influence of the actions we take on our happiness? To be continued. Thank you.